Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. This week, Affrilachian poet Frank X. Walker has a new collection of poetry that looks at black life in Kentucky before, during, and after the Civil War.
Don't call me murderer. My slave name is next. Look at my children. You think they look like Master Gaines too?
A new book remembers the 2022 flood in eastern Kentucky, witnessed by writers trapped at the Appalachian Writers Workshop.
We can't talk about the flood without talking about climate. We can't talk about the flood without talking about coal mining and strip mining.
And birdwatching only sounds relaxing. Sometimes it can get a little wild.
And there were like a dozen black vultures on my car, and they were pulling and eating all the rubber weather stripping all around the door, all around the windshield.
You'll hear these stories and more this week inside Appalachia. Welcome inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams. The word Affrilachian was coined by Kentucky poet Frank X. Walker in 1991. That's when he co-founded the Affrilachian Poets Collective to challenge the idea that Appalachian identity is defined by whiteness. Walker says the word Affrilachian, quote, spoke to the union of Appalachian identity and the region's African American culture and history. He's published several collections and now has a new book, Load In 9 Times. Frank X. Walker, thank you so much for coming on Inside Appalachia.
Honored to be here.
I'm wondering if you could start with reading one of your poems.
I'll start with one in the voice of Margaret Garner, who's made into an institution by the work of Toni Morrison, particularly in her book and movie Beloved. Margaret Garner's character shows up as an escaped enslaved woman who kills her 2-year-old child rather than have her returned back into enslavement after she's caught and captured in Ohio after escaping with her entire family. This is a poem in the voice of Margaret, who was tried over 3 weeks in Cincinnati and was not allowed to testify. So this poem tries to imagine what she might have to say. Testify, Margaret Garner. Maplewood Plantation, Covington, Kentucky. Look at me and my swollen belly. Look at my pale, pale skin. Look at this scar across my face. Don't call me murderer. My slave name is next. Look at my children. You think they look like Master Gaines too? Step back from all this. Stop eyeballing me and the sharp, sharp blade. Take a closer look at the white man. The older Gaines, who is also my daddy, sold me to his brother, which means my uncle has kept me barefoot and with child since I was barely 15. I got 3 more at my waist, 1 on my hip, and 1 more in my belly right now. But don't count the children. Look at the scars on my face. These ain't from my husband's hand. I spared my baby girl not from this life, but from my life. You saw how much she looked like me. Half the lawyers think this whole trial be not about murder, but if we be people or property. But it'd take another woman like Miss Lucy to understand that it really be about something else, something much worser than taking a life or acknowledging one, about making a woman's body your smokehouse and root cellar, about believing her sore, sore plum is your fresh fruit. That's all I got to say.
Whew, man, yeah, that's that.
They hit hard.
Yeah. How did you first conceptualize this book? What planted the idea in your head?
Well, it came about organically. You know, I had been hired to write some short biographies of Civil War soldiers for this new project in Kentucky called Reckoning, Inc. And they wanted to take all these archival documents that were newly available and were being digitized And alongside the invitation to do your own research, they would show examples of bios written by Kentucky writers. And then I realized that this information that I was finding in these documents was so interesting that I was more moved to respond with a poem than a traditional bio. So I asked permission to also include poems with the bios, and they were very excited about that. And then after about a half dozen, anonymous soldiers with no connection to me, I recalled that I had relatives, but I didn't have very much information. And I asked them if they would consider my own relatives with their research. And a week later, they came back with a 99-page document of pension files and affidavits and records connected to Randall and Mary Edlin, which were my third great-great-grandparents. And that changed my whole trajectory. And I just wanted to write about them. I wanted to know more about them. So I abandoned the project that I already started and just focused on researching the Civil War and writing poems in response to what I was finding out about how it impacted Black families whose men and women were connected to Camp Nelson, which had a refugee camp in what is now known as Nicholasville, Kentucky. I'd passed by this place for decades and only visited maybe once or twice, but didn't know how much of my own family story was present there. Both Randall Edlin and Henry Clay Walker, another third great great grandfather, had been stationed there at the same time. Just knowing that I had family members who had been at Camp Nelson made me really interested in going back and revisiting. And this book has kind of grown up around that idea of trying to capture that story that's not singularly about the Civil War, but is about the challenges Black families faced before, during, and immediately after the war. And it tells a different story than the story that the textbooks have put forth.
Yeah, so Marion Randall Edlin and Elvira and Henry Clay Walker are family members to whom you dedicate the book, and they also appear in the book at times. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned about them in the course of researching and writing this?
Well, one of the things that I think that first made an impact for me when considering that question is that my name is Frank X. Walker, and the X in my name is not my birth name. Is that became my nickname in college and then became my legal name when I became a practicing artist and writer in the world. I wanted to be known as Frank X. Walker because the X stood for the unknown in the tradition of Malcolm X, and that unknown meant I don't know my original African name, and that's where I traced my lineage to. And that unknown also had to do with the period of enslavement when census records did not include the names of individuals who were enslaved, just their age, occupation, and maybe their color. So the X represent all that history. And when I'm pouring through these files, I kept coming across Mary Edlin's name. And I noticed one day that her handwriting kept being a little bit different each time. And so I took the chance to zoom in on one of her signatures and realized that in between her name, in between Mary and Edlin, it just said her mark, and there was an X. And a bell went off. And so I pulled back from that image and realized that that document, there were two signatures to the left of that vouched for her signature, which, it took about two more steps in my head to realize that she was illiterate. And so somebody else wrote her name and she had to put an X in the spot. And then that spot had to be identified as her mark. So she was Mary X. Edlin. And I was Frank X. Walker. And I thought I'd been the first X in the family. But here was this woman for almost the same reason, reaching across time to her, third great grandson to communicate something. And to me, that was a really powerful moment.
This is a poetry collection, but it really feels not so much as a collection of poems as sort of this widescreen experience of probably the pivotal moment in American history, immediately before the Civil War, during, and then picking up the pieces after. And we see this moment through all these kind of different perspectives. Enslaved people, their former masters, and some historic figures as well. How were you able to squeeze your brain into all these different perspectives to tell this shared story?
What I learned, having written 5 previous collections of historical poetry, is that the more points of view that are present, the closer to the truth the entire narrative feels. This was a chance to talk about something that everybody knows about. There are literally thousands of books about the Civil War, but I was trying to come at it from a point of view that challenged traditional narratives. In Kentucky, Kentucky's neutrality and then joining the Union, almost presented a romanticized notion of what the Civil War was in Kentucky. But almost none of those historical accounts share a point of view that's from the Black families, the soldiers and their family members, as far as the Civil War was concerned. So I wanted to approach it from that direction. And I knew that I'd have to have, villains and heroes. I wanted to make sure women's voices were present and that children were also included. And if I was going to discuss enslavement, I need to have the individuals who oppress the other people and their victims in the same space.
Coming up, we continue our conversation with Kentucky poet Frank X. Walker. You're Inside Appalachia. I'm Mason Adams.
Support for Inside Appalachia is provided by Concord University, focusing on students' futures. Classes available at concord.edu/apply.
Welcome back. We're continuing with my conversation with Frank X. Walker, co-founder of the Affrilachian Poets and author of the new book, Load In 9 Times. Let's hear another poem from this collection.
Sure, I'll read one of the ones that hit hard. It's also hard to read and maybe hard to listen to because it requires me to pretend to sing part of this song. But it challenges the kind of romanticized notions of the nostalgia that people want to think My Old Kentucky Home, the song, is really about. But if you listen to the lyrics, if you especially listen to the original lyrics, you know the history of Stephen Foster. You know that this song was written as a minstrel song. You know the history of minstrelsy and what that represented in the United States. You understand that there are a lot of layers to the song. So I'm going to read Why I Don't Stand. And it's a poem that actually pulls from 2 sources, the original lyrics to My Old Kentucky Home and from an advertisement from the same year the song was written in that ran in the Lexington paper, advertising the desire to purchase Negroes. So Why I Don't Stand. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes. 'Tis summer, the darkies are gay. The undersigned wishing to purchase a large lot of Negroes. Well, corn tops ripe for the New Orleans market, and the meadows in the bloom. I will pay $1,200 to $1,250 for number 1 young men and $850 to $1,000 for number 1 young women, while the birds make music all the day. In fact, I will pay more for likely Negroes. Weep no more, my lady. Oh, weep no more today than any other trader in Kentucky. We sing one song. My office is adjoining the Broadway Hotel for my old Kentucky home. On Broadway, Lexington, Kentucky, for my old Kentucky home far away, where I or my agent can always be found.
Man.
It hits.
It does hit. So that poem is an example of the first section, which really bracingly drops us into pre-Civil War slavery. and then the book progresses. Can you describe how it's kind of constructed into three parts and how it flows and why you chose that construction?
I wanted to make sure I told a full account of the Civil War through these soldiers' eyes, which meant I had to really unfold how they all came to be soldiers and what the motivation may have been. And the biggest motivation was when they changed the law and not just allowed soldiers in Kentucky to join up, but guaranteed that once they signed their names, their children and their wives and their mothers also became free. But I also wanted to make sure that, the soldiers had a chance to tell their story. So the middle part of the book is mostly in the voices of soldiers who participated. And then once the war was concluded, and I think a story that's undertold is how much effort Kentucky as an institutional space, using legal means, tried to reinstate some of the benefits of having enslaved free labor available. There was a whole period of almost 10 years where there was this effort to put newly free people back in their place, and a whole period of domestic terrorism that was rendered upon free Black people by former Confederate officers. Because if there were 25,000 African American men who, joined the Union Army, there was also as many Kentucky white men who joined the Confederate Army and then returned to Kentucky after the war. And for 10 years, groups of them, sometimes up to 200 former cavalrymen on horseback, rode around central Kentucky, terrorizing newly freed Black men and their families and chased them off their new farms that they were able to purchase with their $300 that was earned money from having been soldiers.
I'm curious, and you're working on this book, what did you learn about the Civil War in Kentucky that most surprised you?
Well, I think, this may sound overstated, but I think I'm surprised, but I shouldn't have been. A lot of people think the Civil War is not over. And there's evidence of those same battles for the same reasons are being fought every day, especially along lines of race and class and, the landed, wealthy, moneyed corporation entities versus the people who have been dispossessed, efforts to divide and conquer, divide peoples, particularly poor people, working class people from each other, and make them believe the enemy is that other person. And I guess the energy we need to work on if we want to land in a better place is, how do we push against that division and figure out a way to support and push towards ending that and working towards a common goal. I hope that people read these poems and realize that they're based on real human beings and get caught up and connected to the emotional stuff that's infused in the poem and experience it like watching a movie, that they leave this book saying, I felt something and I will now think about this period in history differently. And I will look for the lessons that I think are very self-evident in this retelling.
Well, Frank X. Walker, it's been an honor. Thank you for speaking with us at Inside Appalachia.
Thank you, Mason. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Frank X. Walker's new book is Load In 9 Times. It's available from Norton. Hurricane Helene left many without water, power, or cell service in western North Carolina. Largely cut off from the outside world, small towns in the region have been holding daily in-person meetings. These bring people together and help inform them about what comes next. Blue Ridge Public Radio's Gerard Albert III reports.
You can't step anywhere in this town without stepping in mud. At 5 o'clock every afternoon, the residents of Marshall make their way to the Madison County Courthouse, their clothes and shoes caked in mud. They gather in a half circle around the steps and listen.
We've got a few things to mention. The bridge did pass inspection yesterday, so it can be passable. We've got some mobile shower units coming in.
Mayor Aaron Haney has been holding these meetings every day giving out information and asking people what they need. Information from the outside world was almost non-existent, and cell service is still spotty. That left residents in the dark about what was coming next.
As far as, has anybody got any questions, any concerns about today?
Any word on porta potties?
Absolutely. We've got some down here.
Yeah. Okay.
Post office. And post office.
As rain from Hurricane Helene fell, the French Broad River crested at 20 feet and ripped through downtown Marshall. On the buildings that are still standing, the high water mark is past the ceiling. There was so much mud on the roads that it took days to bulldoze a path for cars to drive through. Volunteers have been working to shovel off sidewalks and clear buildings. These town halls, happening all over the region, show how resourceful a community can become when they're essentially cut off.
Anyone need a sump pump? Anybody need a sump pump?
That's why I have never been to.
Yes? Here's your man. Come see him.
Do you know if we got a sump pump?
Are we going to do these 5 o'clock meetings every day?
These are community meetings, so if y'all want them, come together.
Communities across Western North Carolina are still dealing with trying to communicate with limited cell service. These town halls serve as a lifeline for information, supplies, and sometimes just socializing.
All right. If anybody can tell me what day of the week it is, that'd be a good way to start. Wednesday!
Lisa Jennings organized daily meetings in Black Mountain near the town square. Last week, she addressed dozens of residents who took notes and filmed on their phones. Chief of Police Steve Parker and Public Works Director Jamie Matthews were there too.
I know we are hot, we are stinky, we are thirsty, but now we have more resources, so we want to give ourselves some grace.
I think I've hit my crash zone and I'm in exhaustion. Who isn't exhausted here? Who isn't exhausted?
I know people's getting tired, and I know emotions can get involved and people can get snappy, but I will say the sanitation process has been going so smooth, and that's coming from staff. And that's because of you guys. That's because of the community. Just work together, stay calm. We're going to get through this thing.
Jenny Osborne is one of the Black Mountain residents who was at that meeting.
I think a lot of us here felt so disconnected and separated that to the point where, it really was every man for themselves for a hot minute until we knew that there was more out there.
In rural mountain towns, connectivity is going to be an issue for the foreseeable future. But progress in some areas is happening. The town of Black Mountain ended their community meetings over the weekend as cell service returned and some of the power came back on. I'm Gerard Albert III, BPR News.
While some of the heaviest flooding seems to have landed in and around Asheville, North Carolina, towns in East Tennessee were also hit. In one community, heavy rain swelled the Nolichucky River past its banks. It destroyed bridges and the local water supply. WUOT news reporter Riley Thompson has this story from Greene County.
In Greenville, Tennessee, the Kinzer Bridge, which once sat 60 feet above the Nolichucky River, now lays in ruins in the wake of Tropical Storm Helene. Resident Josephine Roberts is at a gas station overlooking the bridge, pick up water being handed out by volunteers.
We're managing, because there's people a lot worse than we are.
Floodwaters destroyed the intake pumps at the Greenville Water Commission's treatment plant. It could take up to a week to fix them. The station Roberts and her sister-in-law Nancy Daniels had driven to pick up water was intended to last 3 hours, but within just 5 minutes, over half their bottles had already been handed out.
Because we figured they were going to be
lined up already,
so that's we came early.
Bob Radink is a pastor of the First Christian Church in Greenville. He helped lead the volunteers passing out water near what's left of the Kinzer Bridge.
I just came from an area where we're cleaning up a bunch of logs, and I was deep in the mud, and then I came straight from there to here, and I'm not smelling too great. But I live in the city. I live in Greenville, and so we're just right there and just without water. But was without power for about 15 minutes, but that was it. It's really nothing that bad. Nothing like what the people in South Greene are dealing with. So my heart goes out to them.
At least 4 bridges in Greene County were destroyed during the tropical storm, and 3 were damaged and remained closed in order to conduct safety inspections before residents are allowed to cross. However, this has left many residents, like Roberts and Daniels, stranded.
Outside of going out to the Asheville Highway, it's our only way to get to Greenville.
Main way to get there. They said there was 11,000 vehicles a day that crossed this bridge.
Wendy Brown lives in a home overlooking the Nolichucky River. Her family did not leave during the evacuation notice and watched as the river rose to take away neighboring homes and part of her own deck.
I stopped counting at a dozen refrigerators. We were seeing propane tanks. We were seeing like feed storage, short silo type things, roofs from houses or barns.
6 people have been confirmed dead in East Tennessee, including 2 Greene County residents, while at least 100 people remain missing in the surrounding areas. Tennessee Governor Bill Lee called a state of emergency on Friday, which drew criticism from some who labeled it as too late, pointing to neighboring states who issued state of emergencies before the storm, allowing for the prepositioning of state emergency assets.
You don't call for an emergency until you know there is one there. So the timing of that occurred with the timing of the emergency itself.
As the damage is surveyed and cleanup begins, Brown believes that East Tennesseans will be able to lean on one another for help.
It's very sad, but it's also, it's one of those things where you feel grateful for what you have, but you also feel for those around you, so we try to help as much as we can. So if you see somebody that needs something, give them a box of granola bars or, a case of water, and, you never know what's going to help.
Members of the Tennessee National Guard are continuing search and rescue operations while transporting needed supplies like food, water, and generators to impacted areas. I'm Riley Thompson in Knoxville.
WUOT reporters Pierce Gentry and Jackie Sieber contributed to this story. The flooding from Hurricane Helene is being described as a 1,000-year flood, which means it's a rare event for East Tennessee and western North Carolina, where whole bridges and buildings were washed away. In 2022, parts of eastern Kentucky were also ravaged by historic floods. Annette Sanook Clapsaddle is an author from the Qualla Boundary, the territory of the eastern band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina. In 2022, Clapsaddle was at the Appalachian Writers Workshop in Hyman, Kentucky, when it was struck by the 1,000-year flood. Her writing is included in the new anthology, Troublesome Rising, which compiles poetry and stories from writers who witnessed the flood. BPR and Grist climate reporter Katie Myers spoke with Clapsaddle about flooding in the mountains.
How do you remember that day, and how has writing helped you process it?
I've never had an experience close to being caught in that flood. I was visiting friends at the settlement school during the Writers Workshop week. I woke up very early. I had no idea anything was going on. Mandy, who was staying with us as well, had smelled the gasoline and had looked out a window and saw a boat going down the road, what should be the road. I mean, it was wild. We wanted to get off that mountain because you also worry about landslides, and part of the road of the driveway had already broken away. It was just trying to figure out what was going on. There's no communication because cell service was down.
The flood was so tragic, and it took so much, and it destroyed so many communities. And it also struck this part of Kentucky, this part of Appalachia, with a really strong literary history. What does it mean to be an Appalachian writer right now in this political moment?
We can't talk about the flood without talking about climate. We can't talk about the flood without talking about coal mining and strip mining. Troublesome Rising is a collection of writers whose heart was at first broken that night into that morning. I think we've become so much more resolved when you watched Eastern Kentucky basically dig themselves out.
Because I'm a climate journalist, I'm always thinking about how to communicate about climate change in a way that they won't shut it down.
Right.
Because it's hard, it's overwhelming. How did you and how can writers memorialize this kind of tragedy in a way that allows us to be fully human?
It seems appropriate for the people of this region to memorialize through action and activism, and I think that's what you're seeing as well. There was loss of life, and there is a moment where we have to reckon with that and never forget that, and that has to motivate us to make sure this doesn't happen again or this doesn't happen other places. It has been a constant battle for places like Eastern Kentucky to fight against the effects of extraction and in whatever form that is, right? And for them, it's coal and the chopping off of mountaintops so that rain won't hold the way it holds in the Smoky Mountains. The intent of that word is to remember this is what happens, right? And to know that even though it could rain for 3 days here in Cherokee, North Carolina, and I'm not so worried about a tiny creek, rising up and taking out whole communities. I have to always remember that that's a possibility if we allow things like mountaintop removal and just be vigilant.
You often write about your relationship to the mountains, to family, to home, and to your identity as a member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. And I'm wondering how your identity and family history influence your experience of this flood and your interpretation of its consequences, and what can it teach rural communities in Western North Carolina?
Sure. Yeah. I think one thing that I mentioned in the anthology, and I've definitely talked about, is that Eastern Kentucky is still Cherokee land, right? And Port Shawnee, I don't want to discount other tribes as well, and so I don't see those same borders. For me, it is a situation of this is all Cherokee land. For generations, my family has fought to make sure that we take care of this land. Experiencing the flooding at first on Cherokee land, in Eastern Kentucky, I was angry. I was angry at big business, what had led to this massive flooding, and what a large segment of human beings who are not Cherokee or indigenous came together to rebuild and to take care of people. So many people were working across political differences and even cultural differences to take care of people. And they love the land in the same way. They are fierce protectors of Appalachia in general. And so even though I have this perspective from Cherokee and my historical connection to this land, I think I saw so much of that in the people who came together in Eastern Kentucky to help each other during this disaster. Because that's the other thing we kind of have in common. Tribes and folks from Appalachia and probably some other areas in this country, is you cannot wait on the federal government to take care of you. You just can't sit back and think, somebody's going to rescue you, because history tells us that's not going to happen. It was overwhelming to witness, people in pickup trucks coming around to where we're, cleaning out houses, and the guys in pickup trucks have tetanus shots they're giving workers, and they just know how to do this work, which is sad in some ways because it means they've always had to do this work. I am honored to be a part of this anthology, and I thought I was not going to cry when I was talking. Mostly I tear up when I think about how incredible the people of Eastern Kentucky are.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that with me. And thank you so much for spending the time to talk with me here today.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Katie Myers with Annette Sunnook Clapsaddle. Clapsaddle contributed to Troublesome Rising, a new anthology from the University of Kentucky Press. Nature photographer Matt Williams grew up exploring the outdoors in the Midwest. Later, he made a career as a conservationist, working for the Nature Conservancy in Indiana. He banded endangered birds and restored natural habitats. That experience led to a second career in photography. Williams has published 3 books, including his latest, Endangered and Disappearing Birds of Appalachia and the Southeast. Producer Bill Lynch spoke with Williams about the book.
I looked up your website to get a little background on you. As I understand it, you became interested in nature around the age of 10. So that's a very specific number. So what started your interest in nature?
Yeah, that's about right. I think it was about 10 years old. And my grandfather was into nature and birds. He worked for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And when I was a kid, we would go to their house occasionally, and he put a pair of binoculars in my hand and told me we are going to go for a walk. And we went out and saw indigo bunting and red-headed woodpecker, saw some nesting great blue herons, and I was hooked. That's kind of what got me started, and has just been a passion of mine ever since then.
How about photography? Were you a young photographer, or did you get there late?
Photography was much later for me. Always had an interest in nature and just loved being outside. Where I grew up, was able to get out and just kind of wander the woods, and that was a lot of fun. But I didn't really take a camera with me back then. And then after a while, I just started to think, it would be great to not only have these experiences myself, see these really cool things, but be able to somehow bring that back and share that with other people. Because it's one thing to kind of tell people, oh, I saw this really cool bird, but it's a whole other thing to be able to show them a picture of what you saw. And so it was much later, I would say just within the last 15 years or so is when I've really gotten into photography. It's very frustrating at times, especially bird photography will drive you crazy because you get a lot of pictures of a bird's tail as it's flying away or an empty branch, which aren't so great. But if you stick with it, you might take hundreds of pictures in a day, but if you get 2 or 3 that you really love, those are the ones that you remember, and it's just a feeling of accomplishment and excitement.
How did you find yourself doing a book about Appalachia and the South?
Back in late, it was probably around 2017, I would say, I started to work on this book about declining birds, disappearing birds of the Midwest. And I covered 40 species that either spend the winter or the breeding season or migration somewhere in the Midwestern states. I loved that project. It was so much fun to do it. And after it was done, I thought, oh boy, what am I going to do now? Because that book was so much fun to work on. And I thought, well, that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as birds that are declining. There are other parts of the country that are experiencing the same thing. And so maybe we look at some other spots. And so kind of see this as a series, this disappearing birds series. The first book was Midwest. Second book was Appalachia in the southeastern US. It was just as much, I would say even more fun the second time around, living out of the back of my van for a couple weeks at a time. I wouldn't recommend that, but it was great for what I was doing because it allowed me to be really mobile. And if I got the shots that I needed for that day, I could just load up and head out and drive to the next spot and try and get other shots the next day. And if I didn't, I could just stay where I was. And there was no calendar, there were no reservations, all that kind of stuff. It was what it was. But yeah, that was a great project. I spent time in the Carolinas, drove through West Virginia, spent time in Kentucky, a lot of time in Florida, Georgia, got to see some beautiful, beautiful country and some amazing birds. And it was just a great experience.
So how long did it take to get out there and to take pictures of these birds?
That's a hard question to answer because some of the pictures I already had. Part of the motivation too for these books was I was spending a lot of time doing bird photography, and I felt bad about, in a way, about, gosh, what am I going to do with all these pictures, and how am I going to use this in a more productive way than just it's fun. Some of the photos I already had from previous family vacations and other trips and things like that, but a lot of them I needed to spend time, just dedicate time to being there. These are tough species to photograph because they are rare, declining species. Wanted to be really careful about how I did that so that I wasn't causing disturbance or issues for the birds by my presence being there, trying to get pictures of them. And so it took a while. I would say for this particular book, it probably took about 4 years from start to finish. And like I say, that wasn't solid 4 years working on it because I was working another job full time. It was, when I had time, weekends, evenings, taking some vacation time and doing some trips down for specific target birds that I knew that needed to be a part of this project. And I really focused on declining species, birds that are in trouble, but beautiful birds as well, because I wanted the photographs to really be impactful. And I also included a lot of birds that I just thought had a really interesting story, birds that I was hoping that would really draw people in. I think there's a lot of people out there who have bird feeders or, enjoy this bird song in their backyard, but maybe this is a way to draw them in even further and help them understand some of the challenges that are facing our birds today and what we stand to lose in the near future unless we're able to turn some things around. And maybe birds is an avenue to start with people into an even bigger conversation about conservation in general.
What was the most difficult one that you got?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a couple that were challenging. There's a little bird called a salt marsh sparrow, and it's pretty small, maybe just 5-ish inches long. And they don't sing very much, and they spend a lot of their time actually almost mouse-like, kind of going through the grasses in these salt marshes along the Atlantic coast. The numbers are very low. They're not doing very well with sea level rise and other issues that are destroying that habitat. That was one I tried for several times in a lot of different places and just kept striking out and finally was able to get some nice shots. And so when I see that picture in the book, it just makes me happy because I know how hard I worked and how many miles I trudged through marsh and how many mosquito bites I got to get those shots. And then in a different way, I also had a tough time getting purple gallinule, which isn't that rare of a bird, but they are declining with loss of wetlands. And just a gorgeous, gorgeous, bright purple bird with red, aqua, just really striking. They have long yellow legs and long toes that they use to walk on lily pads and almost look like they're walking on water at times. But I was in the Everglades, got there early. There was a sign that said, "Watch out for the vultures, and you might want to cover your car before you leave the parking lot." And so I talked to a ranger who was there, and he said, "Yeah, they can be a problem. You might want to cover your car with a tarp before you leave." I wasn't really familiar with that issue and was kind of in a hurry. I had gotten there late and wanted to get out on the trail while the light was still good and get these shots of purple gallinules in the Everglades. And so I looked briefly, I didn't see any tarps, and I thought it'll be okay. I'm only going to be out there for, half hour. I'll be back soon. And so I went out and sure enough, found the gallinules, was getting great shots, having a great time. There were some swallow-tailed kites that I was able to get some photos of. After quite a while out there, there was a woman who came down the trail and she said, "Do you happen to own a dark blue Dodge minivan?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Well, you need to get back to the parking lot because the vultures are destroying your car." I went back out there and there were like a dozen black vultures on my car, and they were pulling and eating all the rubber weather stripping all around the door, all around the windshield. I had never seen anything like that, but they actually did some damage. And it was the craziest thing. It seems like, what if those vultures are eating that stuff? How are they surviving that? It doesn't seem like it'd be very good for them either. So as I look through the book, each of these pictures in the book kind of has its own story that goes along with it.
About conservation, what's one thing that most of us could do to help the bird population?
There are a couple of things. One thing that may seem silly, it's amazing the number of birds that are killed every year by cats that are pet cats that we let outdoors, and they bring in that chipmunk every once in a while, or they're out there hunting, and you would not believe it, but cats like that kill about 4 billion birds a year. Just keeping your cat indoors or getting it declawed or, whatever you need to do so that it isn't killing birds is one big step. Another thing people can do is look at the coffee that they drink. We think of our birds here in North America, and we think everything that affects them has to be done here in the United States. Well, think of cerulean warbler, for example. And yes, West Virginia is incredibly important for that bird because about 30% of that of the total number of cerulean warblers in the world nest in West Virginia. But That bird then migrates all the way down to the Andes Mountains in South America in the winter and spends half of its life down there. What happens to the habitats where those birds are migrating through is incredibly important. And a lot of forest is being cleared in Central and South America for coffee, for livestock. And so with coffee specifically, one thing that can be done is some coffee plantations are creating shade-grown coffee. So they're leaving some native large trees and growing coffee underneath in the shade. And on those shade-grown coffee farms, they're finding it's much, much more useful to birds who will still use those habitats and be able to feed in those areas versus just a sun-grown coffee plantation with no native trees that are left. Looking for those labels, bird-friendly labels, shade-grown labels is another thing that people can do.
That was photographer Matt Williams. His new book is Endangered and Disappearing Birds of Appalachia and the Southeast. Actor James Earl Jones is perhaps best known as the voice of Darth Vader in the Star Wars films. Jones died last month at the age of 93. In Appalachia, Jones is fondly remembered for his role in the 1987 film Matewan, which was shot in Thurmond, West Virginia. It dramatized a coal miners' strike in the 1920s. WVPB's Curtis Tate spoke with David Wohl, an acting teacher at West Virginia State University, who invited Jones to speak to his students during the filming of Matewan.
Why did James Earl Jones come to West Virginia to be in Matewan?
I think he chose the film because it was just an interesting acting choice for him. And I mean, Sales was really lucky to get him at that point. But when you think about it, he had done the voice of Vader in Star Wars in 76 or 75 or 76. He worked steadily, but he wasn't a movie star. His main work was in theater, in ensemble work especially, and he still continued to act on Broadway and in smaller plays. The first time I saw him was in a tiny play off Broadway, and then I saw him in The Great White Hope, which was the show that won him the Tony Award for Best Actor when he was fairly young. This would have been in the 60s, I think, and so he's not the star, like a Brad Pitt or someone now he would think of, because he was in a lot of independent films, and he wasn't a leading man at that point. He was an ensemble player, character actor, and he knew that. So I think he chose projects that he thought were meaningful to him, and that's one of the things I really respected about him, about his acting, and about the projects that he chose. So I think it spoke to him.
How did you get Jones to come speak to your students?
So we had some faculty, we had students appear in the film, and I knew that Jones. We had been trying to get James Earl Jones as a speaker at State for years and had no luck. And so on a whim, I knew the casting director told me where they were staying, which is one of the motels in Beckley. The cast, while they were down there. Connell Lodge, or one of the cheap motels, sort of that was out there, and I called a couple of times and just asked to speak to him, and just sort of luckily he actually answered the phone. And anyway, before he hung up, I said, "Hey, I'm a theater instructor at West Virginia State. It's a historically black college. We'd love to have you come up for a day. I can give you probably $500 or $1,000 and pick you up and bring you to campus." And he said, "I don't know what the shooting schedule is going to be, but I'd love to do it." And I said, "Great." And so we traded phone calls back and forth. And I think we scheduled one day, and they had a shoot. He was called for that day. We couldn't do it. And so sort of at the last minute, he said, "I'm free. Can someone come get me?" I said, "I will send a student out and bring you to campus," and which I did. And I don't even remember what month it was. I think it was winter, though, January, February, anyway. And I happened to be teaching my acting class that day at the Fine Arts Building. And so he came in around 9 o'clock. I think my class was 9:30, introduced myself. And he sat down with the class for an hour and a half and talked about his experience and his career and acting tips. And he was just marvelous, just wonderful.
The film got many critical accolades, but few awards. Why?
Yeah, because it's not a studio film, so they couldn't publicize it, they couldn't release it, widely. It's one of the difficulties that independent filmmakers still have, unless you've, in these days, unless it's a huge Marvel film, or it's just tough, unless you've got backing, and that's the one difficulty in getting your films out there and getting them widely. I mean, all of his films have gotten critically acclaimed, but they don't make money, in terms of how much money you're going to put up. So they've got to do it on the cheap. Critically acclaimed doesn't mean you're going to be successful at the box office. And it's not the kind of film, it's not the feel good, great film. It's got a story. It's slow in developing. The characters are really interesting, but it's not an action film. It's not a comedy. It's not, monsters. And so, films like that are always going to have a small audience, and that's one of the difficulties in independent filmmaking.
One of the themes of the film that resonates today is that the union movement in the coal fields was a multiracial coalition, whereas the coal companies tried to use racial differences as a wedge between workers to discourage them from forming the union.
It's one of the basic tenets of it. You got the Italian who settled in southern West Virginia, who came over to work in the mines. You had the blacks, and then you had the whites, and they were, I think it was pretty accurate in terms of those sort of disparate communities, and the union sort of bringing it together. I think that was one of the big messages that Sayles wanted to get across in the film by having these sort of separate, identifiable communities, and then the whole idea of the union then bringing it together, in terms of commonalities. It's interesting. It's pretty topical now in terms of a political environment where we've got people sort of trying to divide us, because of our differences. And I think what Sayles was trying to do was saying, we got more in common than you think. And we all have to buy from the company store. We're all living in these horrible conditions. We're not better than anyone else. And I think that's part of the arc message of that movie.
That was David Wohl, Professor Emeritus at West Virginia State University, speaking with Curtis Tate. Till next time, thanks for joining us as we journey throughout Appalachia. Our theme music is by Matt Jackford. Other music this week was provided by Amethyst Kia, Larry Rader, Jeff Ellis, John Blissard, Sierra Farrell, and Blue Dot Sessions. Bill Lynch is our producer. Xander Alloy is our associate producer. Our executive producer is Eric Douglas. Kelly Libby is our editor. Our audio mixer is Patrick Stevens. We had help this week from Folkways editor Jennifer Gorin. You can find us on Instagram @InAppalachia. You can also send us an email to insideappalachia@wvpublic.org. Visit wvpublic.org/InsideAppalachia to subscribe or stream all of our stories. Or look for Inside Appalachia on your favorite podcast app. Inside Appalachia is a production of West Virginia Public Broadcasting.